Many people today believe that it was the Europeans that first initiated the transatlantic slave trade, but that simply is not the truth. There was another race of people that actually started selling African Hebrew slaves, and that race of people are the Arabs. The Europeans jumped on the bandwagon eventually, causing the worst type of slavery that there has ever been.
The trans-Saharan slave trade was pioneered by the Arabs. They were responsible for selling the Hebrew Israelites into slavery to the European traders. There were over 112 million casualties of the Hebrew slaves by the hands of the Islamic slave trade. It is said that between 10 and 18 million Africans were enslaved by Arab slave traders and taken across the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Sahara Desert between the 650s and 1900s. That is why there is a staggering number of lives lost during this era. About 80% of the African slaves died before they could make it to the slave markets. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade to the New World, Arabs supplied African slaves to the Muslim world, which at its peak stretched over 3 continents from the Atlantic, Morocco and Spain, to India and eastern China. Arabs also enslaved Europeans. Can you believe that? Well, it's true. Just know that just about every race, heritage, religion, or a people have been enslaved at least one time or another throughout history. But never to the capacity of forgetting your entire race, creed, heritage, spirituality, and culture as the Hebrew Israelites have.
Deuteronomy chapter 28 verse 68. And Yahuwah shall bring you into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto you. You shall see it no more again, and there you shall be sold unto your enemies as bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you.
The slave trade was a byproduct of the opening of Africa. The Atlantic slave trade arose after trade contacts were first made between the continents Europe, Africa, and Asia, the Old World, with North America and South America being the New World. By the 16th century, throughout the 17th and 18th century, the British, Dutch, French, Americas, as well as the Portuguese, had established outposts on the African coast where they purchased slaves from local African tribal leaders. The Atlantic Ocean, once a formidable barrier that prevented regular interaction between those peoples inhabiting the 4 continents it touched, became a commercial highway that integrated the histories of Africa, Europe, and the Americas for the first time. The Atlantic slave trade is customarily divided into 2 eras, known as the First and Second Atlantic Systems.
The first Atlantic system was the trade of enslaved Africans to primarily South American colonies of the Portuguese and Spanish empires. It accounted for only slightly more than 5% of all Atlantic slave trade. During the first Atlantic system, most of these traders were Portuguese, giving them a near monopoly during the era, even though the Dutch, English, and French traders participated in the slave trade. Portugal came under Spanish legislation that prohibited it from directly engaging in the slave trade as a carrier, and became a target for the traditional enemies of Spain, losing a large share to the Dutch, British, and French. Starting from the 9th all the way till the 19th century, slavery was a benefit to the Muslim countries.
The Second Atlantic System was the trade of enslaved Africans by mostly British, Portuguese, French, and Dutch traders. The main destinations of this phase were the Caribbean colonies and Brazil. As European nations built up economically slave-dependent colonies in the New World. Only slightly more than 6% of the enslaved people exported were traded between 1450 and 1600, 18% in the 17th century. It is estimated that more than half of the slave trade took place during the 18th century, with the British, Portuguese, and French being the main carriers of 9 out of 10 slaves abducted from Africa. English Parliament passed an act legalizing the purchase of slaves in 1545. 100 years prior to this, the Pope declared that possession of slaves was the right of all Christians.
In one hand they bore a gun, and in the other a Bible. The grand entry into slavery was triumph as saving heathen souls. In a nutshell, Yahuwah had made Europeans his vicegerents on earth, and the land they took and the people they traded like cargo was done in the name of Jesus. And ironically, the first ship to bring Africans to the Americas was called the Good Ship Jesus. The British were the biggest transporters of slaves across the Atlantic during the 18th century. The 19th century saw a reduction of the slave trade that accounted to 28.5% of the total Atlantic slave trade. There were over 100 million slaves that lost their heritage, culture, and lives during this era in history.
The different ethnic groups brought to the Americas closely corresponds to the regions of heaviest activity in the slave trade. Over 45 distinct ethnic groups were taken to the Americas during the trade. Of the 45, the 10 most prominent, according to slave documentation of the era, are listed. The Gabi, speakers of Togo, Ghana, and Benin, Aja, Mina, Iwi, Fan. The Akan of Ghana, Cote de l'Ivoire. The Mabundi of Angola, including Ovumbundu. The Pakongo of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola. The Igbo of southeastern Nigeria. The Yoruba of southwestern Nigeria. The Mandi, speakers of Upper Guinea. The Wolof of Senegal and the Gambia. The Chamba of Cameroon. The Makua of Mozambique. European ships crisscrossed the Atlantic using a triangular or three-legged business route between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The first leg of the triangle was from a European port to Africa, in which ships carried supplies for sale and trade, such as copper, cloth, trinkets, slave beads, guns, and ammunition. When the ship arrived, its cargo would be sold or bartered for slaves. The Middle Passage is considered the second leg of the triangular trade. This era of slavery was the most horrific and frightening for the Hebrew slaves because they were kidnapped from their tribes and taken from their homeland and sold into slavery for raw materials. Africans carried to North America, including the Caribbean, left from mainly West Africa, through the Bight of Biafra, Bight of Benin, and the Gold Coast. Between the 16th and the 19th century, the Bight of Biafra was the scene of extensive slave-dealing operations within the Middle Passage. The ship then returned to Europe to complete the triangle. An estimated 14.6% of slaves were taken from the Bight of Biafra between 1650 and the 1900s, the third greatest percentage in the era of the transatlantic slave trade. One of the main ethnic groups enslaved in this era, lasting between the 16th and the late 19th century, was the Igbo tribe.
Slavery led to the exploitation and oppression of Hebrews and Africans. For over 400 years, European colonists brought Africans to the New World as slaves to clear vast tracts of land for the cultivation of sugar, rice, cotton, and tobacco. Millions were kidnapped and enslaved. African societies were ransacked, and entirely new societies built on the labor and lives of the Hebrews. Slavery and colonialism were carried out for the economic enrichment of Europe and its descendants, with the legal and political sanction of presidents, prime ministers, and the church. It was this exploitation of Hebrew labor that led to the expansion of the industry across Britain, the United States, and the world. Slavery and colonialism also created the circumstances which confined Hebrews and African nations to some of the worst conditions experienced by any people in the world today.
The European treatment of enslaved Africans from the late 1400s on was influenced by myths of black inferiority and the promise of wealth that could be gained by using slave labor. It is said about 12 million Africans, or Hebrews, were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. About 8% were brought to North America after 1619, and the rest of the slaves were carried to the islands of the Caribbean and the shores of Central and South America. Crowded vessels sailing to the Caribbean from West Africa first had to sail south before turning northwest and passing through the doldrums. During the journey, slaves traveled most of the way lying down because there wasn't enough room for standing or sitting. They were branded with hot irons like cattle for manufacturing purposes. They were separated by gender, kept naked, packed close together, and the men were chained for long periods of time. No less than 26% of those on board were classed as children, a ratio that no other pre-20th century migration could come close to matching, except for the illegal period of the trade when the conditions at times became even worse. Slave traders typically packed 2 slaves per ton. They were fed a diet of beans, yams, and corn mush. Throughout the slave trade era, filthy conditions ensured endemic gastrointestinal diseases and a range of epidemic pathogens that, together with periodic breakouts of violent resistance, meant that between 20% of those embarked on the ships did not survive the voyage, including white crew members. About 4% of the slaves never made it to the ships.
Between 1650 and 1900, 10.24 million Hebrew slaves arrived in the Americas from the following regions in the following proportions: Senegambia, Senegal and the Gambia, 4.8%. Upper Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea and Sierra Leone, 4.1%. Windward Coast, Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, 1.8%. Gold Coast, Ghana and east of Cote d'Ivoire, 10.4%. Bight of Benin, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria west of the Niger Delta, 20.2%. Bight of Biafra, Nigeria east of the Niger Delta, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon, 14.6%. West Central Africa, Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola, 39.4%. Southeastern Africa, Mozambique, and Madagascar, 4.7%.